Undoubtedly, these last 2 weeks have been up and down and been challenging, and they brought a lot of things into focus that I think we're not always sure how to respond to. And so a couple of you all reached out this week who have children and asked about, what. I have no idea. And for those of you who are trying to explain the current context we find ourselves in to your children, I just say have grace with yourself and continue on that work. I'm thinking of those families that are trying to explain your perspective to loved ones, or what you're seeing for people that may see things differently. And not only in your explaining, but in your listening, I'm praying for grace in the midst of that for all of us, for friends who are perhaps being more vulnerable or more provocative or more uncomfortable, having more difficult conversations than they've ever had with friends and neighbors. I wish you blessings in that journey. This is a time that calls for that kind of work, and for all who would call themselves pilgrims on the journey to understand more deeply, to live more openly, to respond more justly. May God bless this journey as we figure out what that means together in this season. As I was thinking about all of this, I wonder if you have ever found yourself standing on the shore of an ocean, just standing there on the beach and looking out into the horizon. I didn't grow up around water, so these are always monumental experiences in my life. But I wonder if you can envision maybe a time where you've done that, where you've stood on the shore, where you've looked out at the water, where you've looked at the horizon, and the way that it reminds you of how big it is, that the waves somehow continue to roll in one after another, that the tide comes in and goes out, that somehow all of this seems to happen, and all you can see for as far as you can look is the bigness of the ocean around you. It's a reminder of how little we understand. And I wonder if you've been that place, if you've perhaps began to wade into the water, kicked off your shoes and socks perhaps, and taken a few steps in, and maybe you're just into the ankle, or maybe you're into the bottom of the knee. And when I think about all of this, and I think about the context that we're in, my guess is that most all of us find ourselves wading, perhaps ankle deep or knee deep, into things that we don't understand, realizing the bigness and the complexity and the overwhelming nature of the problems that we participate in, that surround us, that we didn't choose but yet exist nonetheless, and that I wonder if we find ourselves in that place. And if you find yourself in the ocean and you're maybe just above the knees, as far as I know, you have three choices. Either one, you can turn around and go back to what feels comfortable, go back to the shore, go back to what you know how to navigate, go back to where your footing is solid and to the way you understand the world to be and to the way you've learned to navigate things. Or two, you can stay where you are, and as the tide comes in, eventually you will be swept off your feet, and perhaps you'll go further down the beach, perhaps you'll go in, perhaps you'll go out a little further, but you can stand still. You will be moved eventually. Or you can go deeper into the water and you can dive in, and you can trust that while you don't know exactly what lies between you and the horizon, and you don't know the direction you're going, and it's not a place that's comfortable and familiar, that may be the next most faithful step. And friends, in this reality, as we talk about what it means to be a nation of many colors, as we talk about the long existent realities of racism and the different starting places that people of different colors of skin have, and the ways that we continue to see violence play out, as we try to figure out what to do in the midst of looting and rioting and protest and conversation and many different voices calling our attention in many directions, it all does feel a bit overwhelming, but I believe this: God is inviting us in this season to go deeper and further into places that we don't fully know and we don't understand. And I hope you'll take that third option to dive into it, to try to grow in your understanding of others' experience, to grow in empathy and compassion, to listen, to understand what's happening in your own soul and heart. So in that ocean that we're all still trying to explore together, this morning's message, I feel like, is nothing more than a thimble full of water. And I'm fully aware of the social location from which I speak as somebody with tremendous privilege. And yet I hope that by the grace of God that this might encourage, might inform, might instruct, might challenge you, us together on this journey. So let's dive in. If you have your Bible, Matthew chapter 5, we'll begin in verse 1. Hear these familiar words. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. I want to focus this morning, as the title of the message suggests, on verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers," the seventh of the 8 Beatitudes. But before we do that, I want to help locate us in the Scripture. So if you've been following along these last several weeks, we've been in the Gospel of John. We jump into the Gospel of Matthew, and there's some different perspectives. Here we come to this place. This is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. These words, let alone the whole Sermon on the Mount, could perhaps occupy our time for weeks and for months together. But I just want to spend 1 week here. And so as we come into the beginning of this Sermon on the Mount, some call it the greatest sermon ever preached. As Jesus begins this instruction, there is some key language that happens there at the end. "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven." All throughout Matthew's gospel, we'll hear about the kingdom of heaven, and what Jesus is preaching about right here from the very beginning of his ministry is about a different kingdom, a different way of being, a kingdom that has been inaugurated in his coming to earth. This has begun. He's saying everything has changed. And throughout Matthew's gospel, in a variety of ways, he will help the people who are following him. And Matthew will help us who read his words now understand what it means to live in that kingdom of heaven. So that's the place that we find ourselves, and that's some of what is being explained to us here in this bit. As I said, we could spend a lot of time in the Beatitudes, but I just want to give one other piece of context that I think is important. The first 4 of the Beatitudes, they talk about conditions that one finds themselves in. So if we hear those, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Those are conditions that one finds themselves in. They're states of being, and all of them talk about some sort of pain, some sort of lack, something that's missing. Those who mourn are often grieving something that's been lost. Those who are poor in spirit are lacking the energy to continue to go into the future that God calls them to. The meek is another understanding for those who physically go without some of life's necessity, for those who seek righteousness. So the first bit is about those who lack, those who want for something. And in each of those, God shows up and God meets people in their moments of need, in their moments of struggle, in their moments of lack. God meets those people. God meets us in our moments of struggle and difficulty. God meets us in our falling short and our failure. God meets us with mercy and grace. And then the second half of the Beatitudes, the following four, I think tell us all about the response that we have when we've encountered grace and mercy like that. It's about action. It's about how we live in relationship with others. Blessed are those who are merciful. That's an action. That's how you live in the world. Blessed are those who are pure in heart, who are so focused on what God is calling them to, that their mission, their focus is pure. Blessed are those who are peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, those engaged in the work of righteousness and thus being persecuted. And I think this is a response to what happens when we're clear about the grace and the mercy we've received in our places, in our times, in our seasons of struggle. And so that's a bit of what Jesus is setting up. And then there is this point, this part that we'll focus on this morning. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Now, I don't know about you. There are times where I read the scriptures and I think, well, perhaps if Jesus would have said this just a little bit differently, it would have been a bit easier to swallow. Perhaps if this would have been presented just maybe one or two words different, I could have been more okay with it. In the face of all that's going on, as my wife and I were talking, and I was sharing that I just have no idea what I'm going to preach on this week, she said, I'm captured by the difference in this season, in this moment, and the difference between peacekeepers and peacemakers. And it's one of those moments where if Jesus would have said, blessed are the peacekeepers, I think it would have been a little bit easier. Let me explain what I mean to you. Peacekeepers are the ones who step into situations of conflict and difficulty and find themselves in between, trying to separate the places of conflict so that things can go back to the status quo, things can calm down a little bit. I read a blog this week about a woman who grew up in a not particularly household, and she said, as the oldest child, I learned very quickly what it was to be a peacekeeper. And when there was conflict between my parents or conflict between my parents and one of my younger siblings, I quickly learned how to intervene, how to step between that, how to separate, how to stop that from happening. And I became a peacekeeper. And when we become peacekeepers, which, friends, hear me say, is not an inherently bad thing, there are times where we need that desperately. There are times right now on the news every night where we need that desperately. But when you, if you find yourself to be a person who often is forced into situations of being peacekeeper, what happens over time is you begin to excuse or take blame for the actions of other people. That if you're in perhaps an abusive relationship, whether that be in your family or a place of work, you begin to just say, I'm going to take blame for this so that everything can calm down. Or you find yourself perhaps making yourself too small. That it feels like de-escalation is the most important piece, and done over and over and over again, we have to make ourselves small, remove ourselves from situations. Peacekeepers oftentimes find themselves stuck in the middle of a difficult place, trying to separate it, trying to get things back in order. And that's good. There's a time and there's a place for that in the midst of immediate conflict, whether that be small conflict within your family, whether that be large conflict on the city scale or the national scale or the international scale. There are times that we need that. This concept of peacekeeping versus peacemaking is something that we often hear about in international politics. That was one of the first times I heard about the difference. There are the peacekeeping missions where some third party inserts themselves between two parties and just tries to separate things long enough for the dust to settle. Then there is more difficult work, and that's the peacemaking. That's the work that requires people to sit down at the table and have conversation. That's the part that challenges us to look with empathy at those we have conflict with. And conflict is one of the primary differences. In peacemaking, what we find is we cannot be avoidant of conflict. Rather, we have to lean into conflict. We find that in order, if we're one of the parties about which peace needs to be made, then we have to bring ourselves into that conversation. We have to be vulnerable, we have to be honest, and we have to be willing to hear the other party as well. Peacemaking is long and slow work. Often it begins with a flashpoint, but the progress is slow. It requires immense, sustained energy to continue to listen and to struggle, to continue to check with your own heart and soul where you're at and how things are going. It requires us to stay engaged for a tremendous amount of time. That's what peacemaking is about. It's about checking oneself first. It's about developing empathy for the other. And my guess is that if you were to think through it, you could think of examples and times in your life where you've been both the peacekeeper and the peacemaker. Perhaps with a partner or a spouse or a friend, you found yourself arguing over and over again, and there was a season where it was peacekeeping, and then there was a time where you said, this has to change. We have to sit down and have a conversation and figure out what's going on, and that's the work of peacemaking. And I want us to understand the difference in these two things in our particular context and our season. Because as I said earlier, there are places and times in the news every night where we see the need for peacekeepers. And we see people in the crowds, and we see people among the police officers doing that work. Sometimes better than others. And we need to have the continued energy into making peace. Into going into a new place, into going and diving into a reality that's going to be challenging, that's going to be difficult, that is unknown for us as a country, going there together, confronting a lot of difficult history. There is a difference in these two ideas. And I think in this moment when we don't find ourselves in immediate conflict, if it's not happening right in front of us, what I think the gospel text invites us to do is to be engaged, to be in the work of peacemaking. If it's not happening right in front of you, if the clash isn't happening right here, then perhaps we need to continue to be engaged in the peacemaking process, which requires listening, which requires checking our own selves, which requires learning, which requires having empathy for the other, whoever the other is, from the perspective that you find yourself. Can I give you a hint also? There are several groups of others for which we need to develop empathy and listen. And so that's the season that we find ourselves in. And like I said, I wish that Jesus would have said, "Blessed are the peacekeepers," because that's much easier. But these words also, for Jesus, they are politically charged and they're carefully chosen. Because Jesus' people, as he is speaking these words, they're occupied by Roman oppressors. And the occupying force, the army, is there, and they dictate how they live, and they're the most powerful force in the world at that time. And what they're doing is they're expanding from place to place by moving their military in, by conquering and then subjugating a people. And this is why that's important. This is why that's interesting, because the Roman Empire said that what they were doing was bringing peace to the world. They honestly believed that that was their work, that through the biggest and the best and the strongest violence, they could bring peace to the world. And if our sole definition of peace is a lack of conflict, if our sole definition of peace doesn't include the wholeness of ourselves and other human beings, if it doesn't include the opportunity to thrive and to flourish for all people, if it doesn't include the whole person, and all persons within a group, then that's a way to have peace. But if we believe that people should thrive, and if we believe that God wants all of God's children to know love and to experience mercy and possibility, then we have to move into something different. So Jesus calls us out of a place of peacemaking, but to make the point most poignant, Jesus says they'll be called the children of God. That also is a little dig at the Roman Empire, who called Caesar, the head of the Roman Empire, the Son of God. Jesus is saying this mission of peacekeeping by violence is not what makes you a child of God, but the work of peacemaking is holy and sacred, and God calls us into that. So friends, what I want to encourage you to do is to recognize that there are moments and there are times where it will be required that we keep the peace. And for many of us, particularly when we find ourselves in the circles of safety of our own neighborhoods, of people who might think and look like us, when we find ourselves in those places, we need to begin the work now of making peace by listening, by educating, by listening to folks who are sharing their struggle and their pain, by taking it seriously, and by understanding what it means for us as individuals, as a community, as a collective and a society to move closer towards the ideals that we have for ourselves. And I hope that we can stay focused on that, sustain the energy to do that for the long time. I think in essence what I'm saying is that there is good work in the peacekeeping, and there is great work to which we have been called, and great struggle in the peacemaking. And I want us not to lose sight of this and get stuck over here. And that's got to be work that each one of us does together. I want to close with some words from Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock. He's the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. This is from his sermon last weekend, talking about the upheaval and the turmoil that we're facing as a country, and what he calls all of us to is to the higher road, to be motivated by love. And I think a part of that, friends, for most of us listening to this morning, a part of that means doing the difficult work of peacemaking, sustained effort in the long haul for that to continue. So hear these words.
But there's a spirit at work in the world. There's something more powerful than powers and principalities. Against the rulers of the darkness of this world, there's something more powerful than spiritual wickedness in high places. So don't be distracted. Don't allow undisciplined provocateurs of hate who engage in looting or who tweet about shooting to hijack the high moral message. Stay on high moral ground and we will win. Love yourself and we will win. Love your neighbor and we will win. Love everybody and we will win. Don't give up and don't give in. Don't give in to despair and don't give in to fear and don't give in to doubt and don't give in to depression and don't give in to cynicism and don't give in to selfishness and don't give in to greed and don't give in to hatred and don't give in to bigotry and don't give in to bitterness and don't give in to violence. Stand up for justice, but always stand in love. And if we stand in love, love will win every time.
Thanks for watching. If you would like to donate to the church, click the link below. For service times, campus locations, and any other info, you can visit graceumc.church.